very welcome here. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Ore and Chelsea to, Ore and Sharon, excuse me, I'm tired, to come to this session. When Ore and Chelsea's book came out, I read about it, I think it was 1st of January, I was sitting out on the beach in Brighton and I read in the newspaper, there's this new book coming out published by Murky Books with Storms. And I thought, God, that sounds like a great book. And it's not out yet. And that woman's manifesto for change, taking up space book. And I got in contact with you, I think I DM'd you on Twitter, which is not something I actually do very often. And you said, yeah, we'll come and talk to you at Sussex. Anyway, in between that, the book coming out, they then turned into rock stars, big sellout audiences all over the place. So Sussex wasn't looking quite so attractive. Amsterdam luckily was. So I'm really, really pleased to have them here because you've been doing such great work promoting not only the book but lots of other things subsequent to that. Ore is also a journalist now at The Economist. She was previously speechwriter for the Deputy President of Nigeria. And she recently completed her journalism degree at Columbia in New York. So I'm really pleased to have Ore to come and talk about this. Unfortunately, Chelsea, her co-author, is unfortunately got COVID, so I'm sure she'll be more than able to take the space for both people. And also I'd like to welcome Sharon Dodua Otoo. Now, hold on, I've got to check I pronounce all these names properly, because, one second, pardon me. Sharon is award-winning German literature writer. The prize she won was the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2016 for a short story. You've got the book there that's now come out. It's Herr Grut setzt sich hin. So basically, Herr Grut sits down. Yes. So it's a brilliant short story, and it was a really massive achievement for her to win this award in German literature. She's subsequently gone on to write another brilliant book, so we're just going to do a little quick promotion here. Ada's Raum, and she'll be giving a reading from that book tomorrow. I really recommend it. It's also on Audible if you fancy a bit of German when you're walking around listening.
Spotify.
What did I say?
You said Audible, but it's probably on Audible.
It is on Audible,
yeah,
as well.
And on Spotify.
And on Spotify, and on Instagram, and whatever. I think it's a really fascinating book to read. It's very recently published in Dutch, and it's coming out in English soon. And I'm really pleased to have Sharon here. And the reason I wanted to invite Sharon is not just because she's written some great books, but we've known each other quite a long time. About 30 years ago, we were so much younger than we are today, as the Beatles used to say. She came to Berlin and was part of an initiative called Schwarze Deutsche. And I think Sharon came to Berlin thinking, I'll go to Berlin and do something like equal opportunities. Got there and thought, oh my God, these guys haven't got a clue, have they, what's going on compared to the kinds of things we were used to doing in the UK. And then she was involved in this Schwarze Deutsche initiative about black Germans. And some of our friends in Germany at the time, especially some of our friends from the East, were like, well, there isn't such a thing, is it? It's an oxymoron. You can't be German and black. Like, that doesn't exist. And he said, well, would you like to meet some people? And I want to invite her, both of them, for different reasons to talk about forms of activism that they've been involved in and how they use their writing as a way of expressing it and using their writing as a way of mobilising different types of things. So that's essentially why I want to have this session and why I'm so pleased to have them here. Sure, that's not a very formal introduction, but that's a real reason. So what we're going to do first of all is Ore is going to give a short talk for about 10 or so minutes about what she's been doing, her work, and then it'll be followed by Sharon talking about what she's been doing, and then we'll open it up for a kind of discussion about what is activism, what forms it takes, what we want to learn out of this. Right, over to you, ladies.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to put I think the book page is a bit nicer because then you can see the cover, so you recognise it in the bookshops. So yes, my name's Ore Ogunbiyi. It's really, really nice to be here with you all. Thank you also, Jackie, for having us. Basically, Taking Up Space was born out of kind of Chelsea and I's friendship. Chelsea and I were best friends through most of uni. We met just before we started at Cambridge at an event for high-achieving black students, really random, and then we kind of bonded because we found out we were both going to Cambridge, and we kind of made all these plans for what we were going to be up to in our first year, and we've been best friends ever since, which is kind of adorable. And once we left, we had been doing we had been involved in activism in different ways when we were at university, and when we left, we got offered the opportunity to write a book, and we were just kind of super excited. It came to us so naturally because these are conversations that we had been having for so much of our time at university, and it just felt very appropriate, felt literally perfect. We knew all the things we wanted to say. We knew that this conversation had kind of been bubbling but hadn't been attacked with the right kind of nuance. A lot of times black women, black people when they're minorities at top universities are kind of treated as a monolith, and we wanted to break down some of those stereotypes. We wanted to talk about the fact that a lot of the racism and the things that we struggled with at university were very subtle. And those are the things that are probably more insidious and harder to deal with because for a lot of people, they're actually quite difficult to identify. So the book covers everything from academia, the activism work we did, to also things that maybe you wouldn't expect in a book that's kind of academic, like dating and how that's very different to do at uni when you're a black woman, at a very white uni when you're a black woman, and making friends and being part of societies and even just like fitting in and those kinds of initial things. I'm going to talk to you through basically the chapters that I think are probably most relevant to this conversation. When I started writing the book, we had 6 months to do this. I was at journalism school at the time and Chelsea was at law school. But we were like, we could do it. We wrote 3,000 word essays in 2 days in Cambridge. Like we can, it's fine. And also, like I said, we knew what we wanted to say. The first chapter I knew I wanted to write is actually the last chapter in the book, and it's called Blacktivism. And I talk about the work that I did as a student activist and even the challenges of identifying myself as an activist. When I got to Cambridge in my first year, I met someone, his name was Amate, and he said, have you noticed that in our dining hall, there's this cockerel? There's this Benin bronze cockerel. And I was like, no. And it'd been there this whole time. And it sits on a shelf and it says in Latin, I couldn't read Latin, but he told me that someone told him that this is what it said in Latin, that basically this was taken from Benin in the punitive expedition of 1897 and gifted to the college in so year. And it was written there in Latin, and this big bronze cockerel kind of sat in our college hall. And he said, and I was shocked. And I was like, what do you mean? Like this thing is just, so everyone just knows that this thing was stolen from Benin and is just sitting here like this is like cute, some like nice interior decoration. And that was the beginning of what we call the Benin Bronze Repatriation Campaign. And I was 2 months into joining Cambridge at this point. We had to first work on getting the students of the college kind of mobilized behind the movement, because we thought if we're going to approach the senior people in this college, we need to be able to say that we have some kind of student mandate. We thought that would be the easy bit, right? We're telling everyone, guys, this thing was stolen from Benin. Why is it sitting in our dining hall? It's time for us to do something about it. That actually did prove quite difficult because there was a lot of squabbling over the means of how we were going to do that repatriation. Where was it going to go? Does it go back to Nigeria? Whereas actually it was stolen from the Benin Kingdom, and what does that mean? And then you had people who were from other colleges but were saying, well, they're from Benin indigenously and they felt like they should have a say as to where this goes. The questions of who's going to look after it if it goes back, do they have the facilities, and even just getting a student mandate to basically go on to even talk to the college about this actually proved quite difficult. And there were a lot of tears, which I didn't expect. And a lot of people who we were up against were also black. And I think it was an interesting learning point for me very early, like I said, 2 months into my time at Cambridge, that you're not automatically just going to agree with everyone just because you share some aspects of your identity. In hindsight, there's a lot from the criticisms that I actually think were right. A lot of the case that we were making to the university, we thought we had to make them see that there were material gains for them. This could be good because it could attract more black students if you show yourself as the college that has taken a stance on this, or if you do this, we can make some big festival celebration out of it, and that could be good for the college. Whereas actually the case for repatriating this cockerel was morally quite plain and clear, right? You know, you've taken this thing, or you haven't taken it, someone's taken it, it's been given to the college, and you're now in a position to give it back, so give it back. So in hindsight, a lot of their criticisms are really correct. We just thought we had to be pragmatic at the time. But those initial lessons that I learned, I think were really, really important. Last year, finally, the cockerel was sent back to Nigeria, but bear in mind, I graduated in 2018, so we spent most of the rest of my 3 years there working towards this. We were in meetings, and people would say, but who's going to look after it? And we'd make the point that, you know, if you take something from someone, who do you think was looking after it before you took it? You know, it's actually... The argument was made to seem extremely complex. Some things about it were complex, but the idea that we should agree that this is worth giving back wasn't ever actually that complex. And we had to try and make the university see that. And a lot of those 3 years, we were kind of pushed around from one person to the other. The college decided it wasn't their responsibility to make a decision, and they were going to leave it up to the university. The university decided that they couldn't tell a college what to do. And so we would go back and forth between both parties. And I think the shifting in the boots was kind of hoping that we would be exhausted, that we would forget, that we would be tired, and that we'd give up. And I think at some point it did feel like we had given up. But we really did have people who believed in the cause and who carried it on after we left, so that we can say that last year the cockerel did actually eventually go back to Nigeria, and it was in the news, and now lots of other universities are doing the same thing, and it's like, oh, it's suddenly so simple, is it? But it took 6 years of work, and I document that quite well in the book, in this last chapter. But it was, I think, my first real introduction into the student activism that I think is super important, but can also be quite exhausting. And I think, you know, when you're in that kind of space and you encounter this kind of thing, you see this cockerel and you hear about its context and you know why it's there. As a Black person, as a Nigerian person, as someone who knows about the history of a lot of this art, I felt this burden to have to do something. Because if I don't do something, if people have come before me and they haven't done anything, then who will? Like, I have to be the one who does this thing. My dad was worried that it would interfere with my studies, that, you know, what if, you know, I don't know, what if they get so annoyed that they chuck you out? And I was like, they couldn't, they dare not. But I mean, it definitely was plausible. And I think, again, those kinds of worries, look at who has to worry about those things more, or who feels that they have to worry about those things. And the people whose futures I was considering, you know, Black students can now go to that dining hall and not have to see that, and not have to feel affronted by this thing, and by what this thing represents. And it can now actually finally go where it always belonged. So there's that chapter. Chelsea opens the book with a chapter on access called Getting In, which I think is super important. And I think there's a reason why it's at the beginning of the book. Chelsea and I come from different class backgrounds. Chelsea's from a working class background. I went to a private school. And that has been very important for how we experienced Cambridge, and how even certain decisions we made, and the things that we expected, and things that we were prepared for. I think I got quite a lot of support from my school, as I think people would expect from a private school, in terms of when it came to applying to Cambridge. Whereas Chelsea was the only one from her school who got into Cambridge, and there was a lot, the kinds of pressures that we faced were quite different. Not to say that there weren't people who also doubted that I could get in, but a lot of people, Chelsea less so, but a lot of the other women and non-binary people that we speak to in this book, who are also from working class backgrounds, spoke a lot in that chapter about how they were doubted before they even put in their applications. So you have their headmasters and headmistresses saying things like, are you sure you want to apply? You know, are you sure that's really the place for you? It might be quite the culture shock. And all this doubt that's surrounded, all this discouragement that is kind of put on them before they're even allowed to consider the opportunity themselves. So she talks a lot about that and how that kind of really changed our perspectives. It also meant that I was prepared for some of the poshness that kind of comes with a place like Cambridge in ways that Chelsea didn't feel that she was at all. But it raises bigger questions about how class and the importance of having an intersectional look at this kind of conversation, because it's easy to look at the outside and be like, oh, they're all black women. But actually, there are some areas where relatively, I have all kinds of privileges that Chelsea didn't have. And having to recognize that I was not the person who was supposed to write that chapter, and even that we needed to get other people who we needed to speak to who could also share their experiences was super important. But when I did then get to university, I spent a lot of my second and third year, Chelsea and I, because we ran the African Caribbean Society, and we did a lot of campaigning to get more black people, and especially black working class people, into Cambridge. So we did media campaigns. We took this picture called, and we did this campaign called #BlackMenOfCambridge and picture went viral, and Stormzy retweeted it. So I have a theory that this is how we got this whole book deal. Because back then when Stormzy was on Twitter, Stormzy shared this picture. But it was a picture of 15 black men just at a Cambridge college, laughing, looking very brotherly and nice and lovely. And we shared it with a message that said, this is all the black men that joined Cambridge with us in the whole university, 15 of them. And it was on the press, BBC carried it, it was everywhere. But the point that we were trying to make was a lot of depictions of young black men, especially young black inner city men, is in gangs, all these false, super reductive stereotypes is what you tend to see black young men in London doing on TV. And we just wanted to switch that up. And so many parents, so many students emailed, messaged us, people were crying. It was a lot about how it encouraged people to apply, how it made people realize that people like them went to Cambridge. But at the same time, it was also supposed to highlight, amid that joy, it was supposed to also highlight just how few black men were in that space with us. But then there were challenges that came with that, even that as a project. We were using our position, as we thought, to try and, lift up the voices of others. But at the same time, people were like, why are you only focusing on men? Like, there's also not as many black women. Well, at the same time, there were 24 black women in our year and only 15 black men. And that was the closest that gap had ever been. There's always far less black men than black women. So we thought, well, we're going to start with the group that we think is most often misrepresented and most underrepresented, but we got a lot of backlash for that. Also, we became super hyper-visible, which is something that I talk about in the book. We were on TV, we were talking about these things really publicly. We became targets for a lot of people's hate as well. A lot of people weren't happy that we felt the need to highlight this. They thought the campaign was weird. They didn't understand why we were drawing attention to the fact that less than 1% of Cambridge's students were black. And of course, there were all kinds of nuances within that. Most of the people in the picture were black African and not black Caribbean, and we had to address that aspect of the conversation as well. So I did lots of that, but this is one area where we've seen lots of tangible change because of how public it was. Over 3 times as many black people who are at Cambridge when we were there are there now, which is amazing to see. And I think it really embarrassed people into doing something about it. And then thirdly, I think the third chapter that's probably maybe most relevant to this conversation is Academia So White. This is my longest chapter in the book, and this is basically where we go after the curriculum, what we're taught, how we're taught, who's teaching it, and the kind of cyclical impacts that exclusive curricula have. In the UK, it's possible to get through to university without having ever encountered a black person in your curriculum. And that's partly because the national curriculum lets that happen, but oftentimes that's continued then into university if universities aren't then challenging that. And one of the points that I'm making in the book is, as universities, you're actually in a position to do more about that. You can design your own curricula in a way that is not as controlled by the Department of Education. So are you making sure that there are black writers on your reading lists? Are you making sure that complete histories are being taught? And also, this isn't just for the social sciences, but how does it impact how you're teaching medicine? I'm thinking dermatology, for example. I'm thinking certain diseases that disproportionately affect black people. All kinds of it goes into that. And then the challenges of trying to decolonize a curriculum. Where do you start from? What kinds of languages of instruction are we dealing with here? It's a real like colossal problem, but can we make some small changes that at least makes the curriculum a little bit more diverse? So we were writing open letters. We were also just doing things in our own work. So I was always trying to bring in examples that were more familiar to me or that I thought deserved some representation in my work. Sometimes it didn't pay off. Sometimes I did actually not get great grades because they thought I'd missed the point. And sometimes it did. But the risks that kind of come with that, some people were doing dissertations on Claudia Rankine's work or Solange Knowles' album and why that is so important for like Afrofuturism. And it's being marked by people who are informed by the same exclusive curricula that we are trying to tackle. So you realize that actually this is quite tough because I'm having to teach my teachers. I'm having to tell them what misogynoir is in my supervisions and seminars because they weren't taught in a curriculum that's more diverse than this. So sometimes it's actually quite difficult to put that pressure on them to make that change. So it's really, it's just kind of dealing with the scale of the problem, but also us trying to deal with what we could, whether that's in our own work, whether that's talking to teachers. And there has been some change in the curricula as well, but at least it's drawn attention to the problem. And the book gave us a platform to also highlight lots of other reading lists that have been actually quite good at showing that this work is also worthy of academic study, and like these works should also be looked at. And when we're talking about history, we should look at this. When we're studying astrology, we should look at this. And it's great. And the rest of the book, there's stuff on mental health, like I said, on dating, on societies and all those kinds of challenges and stuff. But I will leave it there because I feel like I've spoken very quickly and I've said a lot. But also there's going to be time for questions and stuff. But I just kind of wanted to give you a feel of some of the work that we did at uni, how it's important, how it's still important today, and also even the process of writing that book and documenting the work that we did do and the experiences that we had is important in itself because so much of this work will happen and will go untold. And other people will come after and take credit for it, or other people act like it was always naturally going to happen and there was no resistance. So it's also great that these stories are that we were given space to actually tell our stories and our experiences, and that we can talk about the change that has happened since the 3 years ago that it was published. Crazy. But yes, thank you very much. I will leave it there.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. It's fantastic. All right. Laura, sorry.
You're missing Chelsea.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much. That's fantastic. Sharon, should we hand over to you?
I'll just
and then
jump up,
we can have an open discussion with everybody. So
Okay. So shall I? Yeah. That was brilliant. I'm hyped. I'm like, oh, I got so many things to say. But I want to put up a completely different picture, if you don't mind, because I think that it would linking very well to what you've been saying just now. If you give me a moment. Where are the images?
I think it's new EV, yeah? No, that's new. Afbeeling.
This is where it would have been good if I had taken Dutch rather than German. I'm just going to say it like this. I hope that's okay. So look, if I can make that bigger, that's a really pretty picture that I want to have instead of me. And then I'll talk about it. So thank you so much for that. I feel like, oh, yes, and I want to say something about that, and this links to this. I'll try my best to keep it coherent. My name is Sharon Dodua Otoo. I am also Black British. I studied in Royal Holloway, University of London, so I didn't go to Oxbridge. But a lot of the experiences that you've just told us all about deeply resonate with me. I had similar experiences in university. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some similarities and contrasts of what you've just been saying. So one thing that leapt up immediately when Jackie first asked if we would come here today to talk was the similarities in the title, or the links in our title of the book. So the book Taking Up Space, for me, is great. It's a very empowering title. And you can really see, like, yeah, we've been marginalized, we've been kept small, our histories have been kind of hidden, and then to come out and say, right, we're going to take up our space in this normally predominantly white institution or academia in general. And my novel that I wrote in German, for reasons I'll go into another time if it comes up in questions, I wrote a novel called Ada's Raum, which could also be translated as Ada's space, but Raum is a word that means different things, which also are themes of the book. So it means room, it can mean area, it can even refer to like space in terms of spaceships and flight and so on. And the novel explores history, particularly traumatic history, and how this still has an effect on the present day. And I try to think about that in terms of societies, but also in terms of individuals. So we have 4 women in this novel who share the name Ada or Ada, and they live in different historical points in time in different geographical areas. So the historical part of the novel, which is like the first part of the novel, which takes place in West Africa in the 15th century, and then in London in the 19th century, and in Germany 1945 in the 20th century. And the different female characters are contending with traumatic events, both on a personal level and then in the kind of historical level. So in West Africa in the 15th century, we're thinking about colonialism, the onset of colonialism and what that did to communities there. In the 19th century, where I look very much at what's happening in London, the historical figure is based on a real-life person, Ada Lovelace. Many people didn't know that much about. I don't know, is Ada Lovelace more well-known in this context? There's some nodding, there's some shake. Yeah, a bit more well-known though, right? But if I said Charles Dickens, would everybody nod? Yeah. Everybody would nod at Charles Dickens. And that's the point. I mean, I bring these 2 historical figures together in my novel to make also the point that how comes we know so much more about Charles Dickens, who, and I say this as a writer, who was only a writer, but Ada Lovelace was, I'd like someone else who's really good at this to say it. She's credited as being the first, would you like to say it? Could you please say it? She was a computer programmer, lived in the 19th century at a time when, I mean, at the time she wasn't even allowed to go to a library to borrow books. She was really, had to deal with patriarchy and sexism and still managed to do this brilliant work, working on the analytical engine and developing programs and such. And so I look at her context, and then I look at a person who comes from Poland, who has been forced into prostitution in a German concentration camp. And these 3 historical moments are also like traumatic events for the societies that I'm sorry, I didn't explain the London one very much. In London as well, we have Ada Lovelace is also a figure of nobility. She's a lady, and so she belongs to the upper class, and so she's also complicit in class discrimination at the time. And what else is happening in the novel is that this is at the time of the Irish famine. Is that the name? The potato famine. And I kind of allude to the fact that at the time, the British were very ignorant of, the English were very ignorant of what was going on and ignorant of their complicity in this tragedy that was going on just over the water. So there's like a kind of intersectional aspect of the combination of being marginalised but also being privileged and how that works across these different figures. That's the historical part. And then what I do or try to do is raise the idea that in the modern day, the 4th figure, woman who's called Ada or Ada, she is a woman who was raised in Ghana, born in London actually, and then moved to Ghana at a very young age. Raised in Ghana, then learns when she's like 20 years old or such that she has a sister who lives in Germany. So the present day level of the novel, which is the second half of the novel, looks at this last figure's life. It's like a day in the life of this young woman. She's pregnant, she's split up from the father of the baby. That is also a traumatic event in itself, how she became pregnant, and she's looking for a place to live. And this highlights different aspects of what it's like, the reality of being a black young woman in Germany. And one thing that links into what you were saying about the Benin bronze, in the year that I was finishing the novel, so 2019 going on 2020, there were big discussions also in Germany about the Benin bronzes. There's some in Germany also. They're everywhere, actually, right? They were stolen from West Africa at the end of the 19th century, taken to England, and then were sold or given as presents to many different institutions, and some ended up in Berlin. And when I was writing the novel, it was also raised there as a point of contention. Many activists, black activists and allies were saying that these cultural artifacts cannot just be, at the time they were in some universities or some museums and they were being stored. But at the time when I was writing, there was a big discussion about a new museum being opened up called the Humboldt Forum, I would say in German, which was supposed to be like the big flagship cultural all my vocabulary is German right now, so I can speak English, I promise. Like the Humboldt Forum was being opened and was supposed to be displaying cultural goods and art from around the world, and it was supposed to be like the center of Europe, and everybody can come and look at these things if they want to. And we were like, everybody? Like the Benin bronze, for example, would be displayed there, but people from Nigeria are not like just going to be able to fly over, even if they were able to get a visa. So there was a lot of criticism. And in my novel, I used the image or the theme of a bracelet. Now, this is a bracelet that's made up of 33 golden pearls, and we first encountered this bracelet in the 15th century in West Africa. And what we learn of the bracelet is that it's really important. It's what are Fruchtbarkeitsperlen? Thank you very much. Fertility bracelet, fertility beads that were very important in the cultural context in which they first appear. They're stolen in the novel by a Portuguese man who comes, he steals them violently. They end up in Europe. There's lots of gaps in the novel, which is a deliberate move as well, because there are gaps in our history. So the reader is often confused, but that's part of the story, that we are dealing with these gaps. They end up in the 19th century in England, and Ada Lovelace has this bracelet. And in that context, the family believes that it's a family heirloom. It's passed down from generation to generation, ignorant of where this bracelet really comes from, which is very like real life, right? So we have the Queen wandering around with this, what is this jewel in her crown that actually comes from India, but we don't talk about that very much. And then the bracelet disappears again in a violent context and reappears in the concentration camp. It's taken away from the woman who arrives in the concentration camp, and she loses literally everything. She loses her family, she loses everything, and every part of her identity. She just becomes a forced prostitute, and all her history, her language, everything is gone. The bracelet disappears again and reappears in 2019, but we don't see the bracelet in the novel. It's just an image in a catalogue for a museum exhibition. And it stays that way. There isn't a happy... As I was writing the novel, there wasn't in my mind a happy end where this bracelet would somehow be returned to its original context or home. And then, like, I don't know, literally like a month after I'd handed in my manuscript, then the Humboldt Forum was talking about returning the Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. And I was like, what? Damn. But then I thought, no, I'm going to leave it like that because, first of all, the Benin bronzes is one part of a huge story of cultural theft and appropriation. Not all the bronzes, I don't even know if all the bronzes have been found. I don't know, but they're definitely, we're talking a very small percentage. I've been promised to go back. As we speak, I think 2 have gone back from Germany just now, just last week or such. But also there are other things. Bronzes sound quite harmless. That's probably because we don't know really of the context how they were stolen. But there are also other things. There are also human remains that are still in museums and being in universities. And there's a lot of, can they go back? Who should they go back to? How do we do this? And it's kind of disgusting. So in my novel, The bracelet remains in the museum, and the person who thinks he owns the bracelet dies. And so it's not clear. It's clear that there's some kind of movement and something will happen, and that it's a generational work, it's a generational task to get this bracelet to be returned. But we don't see that happy end in the novel. We just know that we will continue to work on that. That's how I dealt with that in an artistic way. I wanted to also talk a little bit about being an activist. I'm also often asked if I am an activist or a writer, or how do they work? How can I be both at the same time? And I answer that I don't really see them as separate. And that's an unusual thing to respond because, as I understand it, in Germany, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in Germany, to write from a kind of political standpoint is kind of deemed, it's not seen to be a good idea. There's a term, littérature engagée, I think, or engagierte Literatur, literature that kind of tries to push an agenda that seems to be not really real art. And my answer is, I believe that it's not possible for artists to be neutral, particularly not when there are times of great, like we're living in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. We're seeing wars continuing within Europe, outside of Europe, on the borders of Europe. I consider that to be a war, what's going on. And the climate crisis is, like, I'm extremely shocked about how this is going. When we look at the political situation in the UK or in the US, these are things that I think artists can't be neutral on. It's not possible to be neutral. I think it's more a case of, do you make it explicit what you're thinking and feeling about these things or not? And I choose to make it explicit and to say where I stand on these issues. And one of the things that I did do, which I always made very explicit, I made explicit that I write from a Black perspective. And this is also difficult to do when the context doesn't understand what you mean by that. So often, I realize often that when I say I'm Black, in Germany, people understood me to be saying, I'm a victim and I'm treated so badly and my life is shit and I'm Black and you're white and you're at fault. And that's actually not what I mean. What I mean is, I'm living in a society where a lot of the way that I experience the world is very much down to different interactions that have to do with what I'm perceived to be and what I perceive myself to be. And the dominant society, through art, through literature, through media, through the telling of history, there is an incredible amount of shaping and framing that goes on, and I have something to do with that. I have to try to negotiate that. And I think many people who are marginalized do. And again, it's a question of whether you make that explicit or not. I also think that being Black means I have the opportunity to learn from people who've gone before me. So I learn from other artists. Specifically, I look at what other Black writers have done and how they use their art to document things that have happened and also to try and affect change. So one of my favorite artists is Toni Morrison. Actually, she's my favorite. I don't even know she is my favorite. I'm a Toni Morrison fan. And what I loved about Toni Morrison's writing is that she went there. So she went for taboo subjects. She wrote, for example, the first novel I read of Toni's was Beloved, which is the story of a formerly enslaved woman who had been running away from her so-called slave owners and knew that they were about to recapture her. And this is based on a true story as well. And rather than just simply be caught again, because she was running with her children and she was also pregnant, she decided to kill her children rather than just let them be captured and enslaved. And she managed to kill one of her children. And the story is about the ghost of this child that she killed. That's Beloved. And there's so much that happens in this novel. She uses a kind of, I don't know what the actual word is, magic realism or science fiction, I'm not sure, but she uses this kind of way of storytelling to give, I think, dignity and voice back to characters or figures that historically haven't been three-dimensional. So if you think about the writings that have gone on about slavery in literary fiction before Beloved, they tended to be works of art that tried to persuade readers that slavery is bad and black people deserve to be treated nicely. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I haven't read. I'm not criticising Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm just saying that the target audience of Uncle Tom's Cabin was people who didn't know that much about slavery, whereas Toni Morrison wasn't interested in that. She was interested in the actual people who had been enslaved and what they had gone through, and she wanted to document that. And how I describe what she does is she takes these very traumatic, very painful histories and transforms them in her writing and gives them back to black communities as art. And this is so healing that I saw that as something that I also wanted to try to do with my art. That's one aspect of the activism. The other aspect is to talk about, coming back to academia so white, there was a criticism of the German literature industry. When was that? In 2021, when my novel was published, 2 other novels were published by, that was a very funny situation actually. In that year, 3 novels, debut writers published their novels in German, and they were not white. That was Das Raum by me. Then there was a writer called Mitu Sanyal, who wrote Identity. I think that's been translated into English by now. And then there was a book called Ministerium der Träume, which is Ministry of Dreams by Hengame Yakubifara. The 3 of us had published in spring 2021, and then the headlines were, oh, there's a revolution. It's all coming now. White people won't be able to publish in Germany anymore. And it's like, yeah, calm down, love, you know. That was it wasn't even a Black Lives Matter thing. It was just like a person of color, 3 of us did it one year. Anyway, in that year, none of the novels that I've just mentioned were nominated for a prize at the, there's a Preis der Leipziger Buchmesse, which is the book fair that takes place in Leipzig every year in the first half of the year. And there were other novels that appeared that year by writers of colour, but the short list of the books that had been nominated for the prize were all white. And some people wrote an open letter, and the hashtag for that open letter was allzu weiß, all too white. And the criticism was not necessarily about the short list. It's only one prize, and only so many people can be shortlisted. But the jury was entirely white. And if you look at the German publishing industry, predominantly, at the time definitely, predominantly made up of white literature critics, white journalists who write about literature, white people who work in publishing houses. Most of the authors writing are white, most of the prize winners are white. I did a presentation once where I just had every year prizes that have been won in the different book categories and all sorts, and the juries and the authors, and everything was very, very white. So the writers of the open letter were saying, we got to do something. I once wrote an angry Twitter rant. I do Twitter and I do it sometimes angrily, but I'm not rude, just angry. And I wrote a rant and I said, look, we can't just keep doing business as usual. We can't sit here and say, oh, we need more black writers, but, no one's applying or no one's writing or what have you, what other excuses. I said, there has to be an intervention. We have to do something different to get a different result. And I said, for example, what about a literature event where you have black authors who read a story? So much like the literature event where I won the prize for that short story, but instead of different people, we'd have an exclusively black German language shortlist of writers, and the jury critics will also be black. And this is the picture that's of the event that took place in May, and it was over 3 days, and 6 authors presented their previously unpublished texts, and 4 jury critics discussed the texts, and it was just an amazing event. Like, by all accounts, everybody who attended and everyone who participated for different reasons keep talking about how much this event meant to them. And it was, in fact, more successful than I wanted it to be, which sounds like a strange thing to say. But I wanted it to be an intervention, a one-off, and then disappear. But people are asking it to be an annual event. So I have to figure that out, how I manage that. But yeah, but the people, we did it as part of the Ruhrfestspiele Recklinghausen. So that's an event that anyway takes place every year and has been, this was the 76th year of the Ruhrfestspiele. And then they are very, very supportive of it and very much behind it and would like it to happen again. So that's an example of something that I've done as an activist. I think I will also stop there, but I would have lots more to say. We can handle maybe some of them in the questions. Yeah. Welcome.
I thank both of you, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, brilliant to hear what you've been doing. So let's open it up to people who want to have questions or comments or anything you want to say, really. Yeah.
Thanks for both of you. I'm looking forward to reading the books. I have a question. You both mentioned stolen art or stolen artifacts in European museums, and I went to the Tropen Museum the other day, and so we have a very good example of what you're talking about, right? At the 500 meters from here, and but they have a big exhibition going on at the moment about their colonial past and trying to contextualize their collection or how the collection came into being. And I've seen similar exhibitions going on, for example, in the Hunterian in Glasgow. And I thought what you think about such approaches. Of course, it can't be a substitute for returning stolen art, but yeah. What do you think about it, and also how such an exhibition must be done that it can be a part of change?
Can I just see there's a couple of questions to make sure that as many people as possible get a chance to speak. There's two more there. Yeah, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much for your speech and also this session. I really appreciate it. I just have a rather personal question. Maybe as an I'm not an activist personally, but I think my life kind of became like an activist, being the only Asian person in my faculty, and in my whole faculty of sociology at the moment, there's one Asian person. Asia's quite big, and I'm the only person. There's one black person. So every time we stand together, we're like, oh, this is a diversity, John. That's how I feel. And what I notice is that every time I try to make my faculty members understand what's going on, or the university understand what's going on, that's different, my experiences, that's different from the other people, I suddenly feel like I'm a fighter. I didn't mean to be, and then it just happened to be that I have to be always fighting for something. And I'm a people pleaser. I don't like to be in a position where I have to be like, hang on, listen to me, and I just want, and then at the same time, I don't want to be silenced, because if I become silent, then the other people will have to fight for everyone too. And suddenly I have all this responsibility for all the Asian people, which I never meant to be. I just studied for my own career. I never thought about becoming the representative of the all Asians in Belgium. I don't. But suddenly that's how I feel, and I don't know. It was so sudden, and I didn't know how to navigate those. There was some fear of, can I survive in academia? Always fighting, and that was the fear, and this responsibility. But at the same time, I'm really glad that I can actually do this. It's not just for me, but anyone who comes after me. But I don't know, I'm not sure what my question is exactly. But how do you navigate, in the midst of all these different feelings that you get as you kind of work as an activist in the university setting or as a writer? That was my question.
I think it is a question. I think it's really useful to share that experience. There's one last in this round of three, and then we'll take Jenny in the next round. And would you like to introduce yourself, because you came in a bit late, so we asked everybody who everybody was.
Okay.
Just so everybody gets to know each other.
I'm Barbara. I'm originally from Slovakia, but I studied at Manchester. And my question is actually about the victim versus artist, or victim versus a person. I have a feeling this is how it works in society, also towards migrants or anybody who is basically racialized. As long as you're a victim, it's okay, because that's how we want you. But the moment you start asserting yourself as a narrator, let's say, of a story, or as somebody who narrates their own story, it becomes a bit of the tension arises. And I wonder whether this is how you also experience this as writers, and of academics.
Okay, would you like to respond to those first three, in whatever way you want to, and then there's another couple I could see.
The question about the exhibitions and the colonial past, I think you're right when you said they can't be a substitute, and that for me is the biggest issue with when I see these exhibitions. A lot of people doing it is like, oh well, if we can show that we're really, really sorry, and like we know it was really bad, then does that maybe absolve us? No, and is the answer. I think also you can have conversations, and if we are serious about talking about contextualizing people's colonial pasts, teach that in not just an exhibition. Exhibitions are important and they are educational vessels on their own, but let that be something that is becoming part of like how we remember these things. Like it can't just be a one-off, here you go, and then we can say we're done, which my worry is when we resort to exhibitions is like, okay, that's that done. That's how the attitude around them tends to go. So I'd like to see it as part of a whole movement. I'd like to see it as, yes, we're contextualizing this history and raising awareness about this thing that's really important and filling in these gaps and the bits that have been left out for so long. And we are doing the work that it takes to repatriate it. All the kinds of things that the institutions say, oh, well, maybe we can have things on like, this is part of the arguments they give when they don't want to send things back. Maybe we can loan it to them, or maybe we can put like a hologram of the thing, or maybe all these kind of really creative things. Let's do that the other way around. How about you give it back, and then we can talk about people loaning it to you for you to do your big exhibitions on contextualizing the colonial past. So having, academics who are actually from these countries coming and teaching about these things, which I think where things get actually important and conversational, and we're talking about these things. People who know about the context and about the history coming and being present and talking about work. Commission new work that can talk about it as well. It doesn't have to be you just use it as an opportunity to display everything that has been looted. You can commission new work that also speaks to those legacies, that also speaks to those histories. It doesn't have to be those stuff. We can have stories and conversations about this stuff without having to profit off of these things that have already been profited off of for so long. So yes, you were right. It doesn't substitute these stuff. It shouldn't. But often it is used to, which is why I'm personally not a fan. I'm always like, what else is going on? Question about navigating being the... Trust me, I know. Chelsea, my co-author, was the only person in her year who did history. So that was 200 and something people, and it was just her that was black. And so every time things about colonial history would come up, or any loose thing of slavery, everyone starts to pretend like they're scratching their neck, and they just want to see like what Chelsea's reaction is. Like, oh, someone asked a weird question, oh, let's look at Chelsea. It's definitely a thing. What we say in the book, and I don't actually know if everyone agrees with this, but that's not really the point, is that whether or not you decide to engage in this conversation should be a personal decision. And actually the pressure that we feel, being a minority in that space, being the only one from that background who can speak, and because even then you can't speak for the whole of Asia, so even that pressure is unfair. But just being in that situation and feeling that is a very unique kind of pressure that if you have lived your whole life being the majority, you would never really know what that feels like, right? So it's tough. But whether or not you then, it's perfectly fine to be like, I'm just here to do my work, to do my research, to get my degree and get by. You should be allowed to do that. And this is what we write in the book. It's what I say in activism chapter. Because a lot of people feel like they have to, and then they're not happy. They're not doing it because they want to. They feel like they've been forced to do it. They've been thrust into this role of activism, not because they actually have the real zeal to do it. Of course they want people like them to do well, and people ask them to do well. But it comes at a cost to your grades. It can come at a cost to time spent doing other things. You might just want to play sport, like those kinds of things. I speak about the privilege of mediocrity as well. Like, sometimes you just want to get your 2-1 and go home. You should, if that's what you want, you should be allowed to do. I know, but like, everyone's like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to also fight for everyone black, then you've also got to fight for everyone African, then you've also got to fight for every woman, then you've also got to fight for everyone from your sexual identity. It can be a lot, and that pressure isn't always fair.
Could you say that again?
Sorry, Siri. Siri just gets involved in my conversation all the time. Okay, but no, the short answer is, I understand the pressure, but whether or not you take that on, whether or not you take on that role should be able to be up to you. You should be able to highlight once or twice, these are issues you have here, and everyone else's whose job it is to do that research, to draw up your curriculum, to decide what's being taught, to deal with challenges or access. It's their job. There are people who are actually being paid to do this stuff. Draw attention to the problem, but then you should be able to focus on your own work if that's what you want to do. If you do want to go and be an activist and do it, go ahead, and make it fun and rally people up and enjoy it, but it should be your choice. You shouldn't have to do it just because you're the only one there from your background. That's my opinion on that. And about being the victim and, kind of dealing with that I try and spin it as much as possible in my work, in my writing. I don't like, of course, it's definitely something that, even when I go and speak at events, I'm like, oh, are people feeling all bad that you went through this, that's not really what I want anyone's takeaway to be. But if that's what's going to make you listen, cool. And then I would like to take that and kind of reclaim it a little bit, and not really feed into it, because it's something that I feel like is put on me, and not me actually, that's not actually what I want to do with my position or my platform. I don't think it's helpful. There's definitely work to do. I think, like I said, it draws people into conversation, that can be helpful, but then I try and reclaim that and reposition it, because I don't think I'm a victim at all. I think I had a relatively tough time. There are also bits of Cambridge that I loved and enjoyed, which we talk about in the book as well. And yeah, there's a thing we can do with that, even though everyone else might be looking like, oh, babes. We can be like, but it now has put us in a position where we can talk about all these things, and we can do all these really amazing things and mobilize people and get more black people into these unis, and it's actually quite exciting when we can spin it on its head in that way. So yeah.
Do you want to respond?
Yes, happily.
I'll just very briefly,
yeah.
It's 1:15, there's a break now, so if anybody feels they need to go, you're very welcome to go. If anybody would like to stay, because I think there's some people who still have questions to ask, you're very welcome to stay, so please don't, feel free to use the spaces you want. But over to you, Sharon.
So I think I'll go in reverse order. I was really fascinated about the word, the tension of being a narrator. Being a narrator, I hadn't actually thought of it like that before, but I think that's exactly what my favourite author, Toni Morrison, was talking about when Toni Morrison wrote Playing in the Dark, and talked a lot about how typically literature has tried to have this neutral backdrop, and then every time there's a black figure in literature, that black figure is actually highlighting something. So like I said, Uncle Tom is highlighting how bad slavery is and we should be nice to black people. And then the thought of Uncle Tom writing his own book is like, oh, what would Uncle Tom say about us? And that's scary. And I hadn't thought about that much. I hadn't taken that seriously, but I think that's a lot of the, I want to say backlash, but I think that's a lot of what's happening is that when I talk or when I write, that there's a lot of nervousness about what am I going to say, what family secrets am I going to spill, and I have a lot. Wait till my next book. And the other thing that I realized happens is, and this I really need to take more seriously, it's a little bit like this single black person in a white space. I lend legitimacy to people often. So if I'm invited to participate in a panel discussion, this is not a good example, but there are other panel discussions I'm invited to attend, then I lend that panel a certain, oh, this is completely politically correct and cool and anti-racist actually, because Sharon Dodua Otoo is there. And I had a problem with that because there was a literature critic who did something highly troubling on television a couple of years ago, or when was it, 2013. So around 10 years ago, a literature critic went on TV in blackface to criticize something. It was a very bad idea. He got very heavily criticized for that. And a lot of people in the black German community and other communities, allies, were like, this guy should be cancelled kind of thing. It was a thing before cancel culture. He would have been cancelled if there had been cancel culture. In any case, he did this thing, and then since then, he has read my book. So 10 years later, my book appeared, he read my book, he really liked it, and he asked me to go to his program, and he interviewed me on TV about it. And I decided explicitly to take that step because I knew that people who like him right? This is my calculation. People who like him and like what he does, and maybe thought that what he did wasn't that bad, would then have access to this book, which drops a lot of knowledge. And you can read about what he did. If you read the book well, you can read about blackface and stuff like that in the book. And that was like a counter-narrative to what he did. And he also introduced them to me as a person, and then from me as a person, they get to know about other authors and such. So this was my calculation. What I didn't realize would happen was apparently I lent him legitimacy. So it was like I'd forgiven him, and therefore everybody should forgive him. And I got a lot of trouble for that. Forced to be an activist, I agree with you entirely. And I also, I like that you say you should decide. And I do agree with that too. And I also think you can decide on a daily basis. You know, today I just cannot be asked.
Yeah.
Like, just leave me alone. Ask me tomorrow if I feel like it. So it's completely up to you. And at the same time, I'm really aware, like I know my time is limited because I feel very tired. I feel very tired of hearing the same questions and rustling up the energy to answer it in the same polite way. I can give an example. In my book, I write a scene where the main character, Ada, in 2019, is talking to her sister, Elle. Her sister has grown up in Germany and has always been confronted with this question, where do you come from? I mean, where do you really come from? And Elle only knows Germany. And her sister, who grew up in Ghana, is like, yeah, but it's not that bad. So the two of them are having this discourse about the question. And the question is a question in Germany that's like, a lot of people still don't really understand what the problem with it is. So this question is raised in the book and discussed by the two characters. And then I'll be asked that question on stage. Sharon, can you please explain to us? And I'm like, if you read the book, you'd already know. Like, I don't need to explain it because I'm doing art. I'm not doing anti-racist education. That's not what I'm really doing. But I will give you a polite answer on stage, still. And then at some point I'll be tired, and then somebody else will take that on. And I might stop writing completely. I don't know. I'm just saying it is definitely a choice. But one thing I do take seriously is, like I said, when I was criticized for appearing on television next to this man, is that there's a lot of things that happen and are outside of my control. So if I say something, it automatically is, okay, if she says it, it must be true. And that can be very negative to people. So if I say something like, yeah, I don't think the question, where do you come from, is racist, then a lot of people will use that and bash other black people with it. So I do take that seriously also. It's like a balancing act. And then the first question was about the museums. I have to say, who asked that question? Yeah. I don't know that much about museums. And recently I was sitting on a panel in I think it was in Leipzig. Is it Grassi Museum, if anybody knows? Is that right? Grassi Museum in Leipzig. And they're doing exactly that. They've got a brilliant exhibition and they really go into great depth about their own history and what they're doing with these objects and trying to make it all very transparent. And they have even sort of like repatriation rituals in the museum, so every so often certain parts of the museum are closed for communities to come and take care, do what the work is necessary to then take the artifacts back. And I had a lot of respect for that, but still my main premise as a black person I was raised pretty much working class. I had no access to museums in my childhood outside of what we did in school. And that was always boring. So we were forced to go somewhere and stand in front of something. And usually, my experience was if black people were anywhere represented in museums, it was always something negative. I always came away feeling shamed. And I have this hunch that the basic premise of a museum doesn't work. The basic premise of saying, we're going to display artifacts from around the world, it kind of freezes these different geographical areas in a point in time, and they can't, they just stay there. I find it very troubling and difficult. So I haven't got any constructive advice for a museum, although I do see there's a lot of brilliant work going on now, and there are a lot of people I really respect who work in the museum context and take those criticisms on board and are trying to do something with it. I would say there's no easy answer.
Great, there's a couple more questions. I just want to make one comment to your question about the faculty and being the sole representative from Asia. One thing, I think, for example, with the EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Champion, which I used to be, and I actually hate that. I mean, I didn't, where's my super robe, my invisible cape? You know, single-handedly, Jackie comes to save the world. Oh my God, it's so exhausting and the data doesn't work from HR. One of the things we were talking to EY, a big consultancy firm for the centre we have, about this issue, and the person in HR at EY said, equality is not the equality officer's responsibility. We talk about belonging, and it's actually the responsibility of the whole department. So what are you doing about helping ensure that people are represented? It's a bit like the question I got at the plenary, when that very nice older man from New York said he has knowledge and action, but he doesn't feel any power. And I said, well, use your white privilege. And then he turned around and went, yes, right answer. You know, but it is asking, because why are these committees staffed with people of colour and women? So it has to say to the rest of the faculty, what are you doing about it? And I think there's no harm in asking that question, because it is their responsibility to make sure that everybody feels their sense of belonging, and it's not just about a few targets. Anyway, enough from me. You want to ask a question, and Ginny. Ginny was first, and then you were next. And are there any other ones? Okay, let's go, Ginny. And then you.
Okay, I'll try to be fast, but I guess before asking the question, it's sort of important to situate yourself. First to say, I really enjoyed hearing about your books. I look forward to reading them. I am a white woman from the U.S. South. I grew up, you know, in a particular kind of history of racism, and then I moved to the north to go to college, northeast U.S. I spent 10 years in the UK at an elite university, and have done work and lived in Germany for periods of time also within universities, and in all these different regions and parts of the world. I've spent a lot of time talking to my black friends about their own experiences with racism, and you know, also thought about my experience as a privileged white woman in these different spaces. So that's setting up the question of, to what extent do you think the Black Lives Matter movement in the US has had some impact on, I think, sort of making visible perhaps the universal experience that Black people face in different countries, and also driving forward activism or change in any particular country? And I guess I kind of ask that because of the way in which, talking to German friends recently, they said for the first time you can talk about race in Germany. That in the past there was this kind of taboo around the word racism.
May I ask, do you mean black friends or German people in general?
Black friends and German and white, sorry.
Yeah, I get
Black German friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was
so like there's this term in Germany, the
Migrationshintergrund,
and whenever you would say race, white, Germans would often say, no, don't say race, don't use the word race because of Nazis, we don't talk about race here, but also a kind of particular history of that. And this perception that that is somehow changing, and part of that has to do with perhaps a more universal discussion about some of these similar kinds of experiences or issues. And I particularly raise that because we're having in some ways that international conversation here.
Mm.
Okay, that's a question, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got those. And you wanted to ask. You wanted to ask a question.
Yes. I think by now you have reflected on that, but I noted that you both in different ways had experiences of encountering this additional level of complication. So there was the picture of the 15 black men at Cambridge, but then the question was, what about the women? And this additional level of doing more justification, more work, or writing a book, but then being an activist, which is not suddenly talking about what does the identity of an artist mean, and can activism be part of that? And I was wondering how, I noticed these experiences, how that's distracting, and whether that requires additional kind of labor to refocus on the actual point, or maybe these experiences are so small among all the larger project, that the book project, that it's kind of okay, just ignore that and try to deal with it.
Can I start with this question, please? Yes. I think it's important. I've learned that it's okay to say no to some things. And like I appreciated when the question about museums, and you were like, I don't actually know that much about museums. So many times we get presented, Chelsea and I get presented with things that people assume we can speak on because we've written taking up space, that actually really we can't. The bulk of taking up space is us talking about our experiences and the experiences of the other people that we interviewed and what we've learned as a result of our own experiences and from where those experiences have taken us. So even my knowledge of museums is quite limited. I wouldn't probably, if like a big art historical kind of thing invited me to come and speak at something, I would probably sit it out. I'd hand it over to someone else, not even just from a perspective of like the labour, because some of the extra stuff I'm happy to do, like speaking at conferences, I love speaking at universities and to schools. It's probably like my favourite audience, like of people I could possibly speak to. I love that stuff because they're really engaged and it's great. Those are still things I can speak on, and I always stress, even when we get asked to speak on certain things, from just bear in mind, like if you've read Taking Up Space, this is where our perspectives are coming from. Because I think if not, kind of like the question that was raised earlier, you end up becoming the poster girls for everything to kind of do with black people. And at that point, I don't even think it's a question about labour. Like, a lot of these things you get paid for or compensated for in some kind of way. It's just, realistically, I can't speak about that. I can't represent everyone who's black and African. I can't speak on all issues that affect people who look like me. Even when people start talking about migration, I'm like, my story of moving between the UK and Nigeria is not, like, I cannot speak for people who have migrated under much more difficult circumstances, for example. Like, sometimes I think it's just okay to sit it out, and I think if not, everyone else will project onto you what they think you can do and what you should be able to talk about. But you have to draw up some boundaries of like, really my expertise does not go that far, really my experiences do not lend me to speak in any informed way about this kind of thing, even in times when I am willing to do the work, which is just, sometimes I just have to agree that it's not, I just have no right or place to really be speaking about any of those things, because it's easy for everyone else to tell you that you can just because of what you have supposedly experienced. So you sometimes have to draw those lines. And the question about Black Lives Matter's impact. This is such an interesting one. We kind of get variations of it often, but it's I think people's answers vary. I'm in two minds. I think it really did publicize some stuff that I'm like, it almost shocked me how little people knew that if that was what it took for so many people to be aware of, like, wait, did you not realize how racist the world was before? Or like, did you? So, but for some people, I mean, people who at university were a problem for me were getting involved in this conversation in ways that I was like, you must be joking. Like, I tried to explain that to you literally 4 years ago. It was interesting. It just felt like it was coming from everywhere. Corporations also seemed to be doing something, never enough, but something. People seem to be moving. So I think in terms of publicity, it was super important. I also acknowledge that the German context around the word race is quite specific, and I won't actually get into that too much because I think there's specific Germanness to some of that sentiment as well. On the other hand, though, I do think it has propelled a very American version of race onto everyone in the world, which is just not how it goes. And sorry, no offense to anybody who's American, including yourself, but a lot of discourse around a lot of things tends to end up being very American-centered, just because of the way that American culture has dominated even just things like what we watch on TV and like what we hear in music and things. Sometimes, I mean, having to explain to Nigerians, for example, who started also going out on protests, a small number though, but protests like Nigerian Lives Matter, there was a lot of parallels in like police brutality conversations, but at the same time, it just wasn't the most pressing problem for not Nigerians who internationally in the world are thinking about how to get visas or how difficult it is for them in other areas of like education, for example. And so I think on the one hand it has really helped, but it's helped propel a very American version of the story to the fore at the expense of other people and other experiences of blackness, which we kind of expected because it's kind of how Americanness penetrates lots of other depictions of things anyway. So yes, on the one hand useful, on the one hand other versions of blackness have kind of been pushed to the background at the expense, but still useful.
I would agree with that. I think, but also when it happened in 2020, when most people were in lockdown, and it was just a very specific time. There was a lot going on, and it really concentrated the energies in a way that hadn't been possible before, I think. And yes, Black Lives Matter was a huge thing. Before that, though, like 2020 was very specific, but before that, it's also been there. And then I'd say before there was, and I think the people who initiated Black Lives Matter would agree that there was a lot of stuff going on way before that, before this movement began. So they like to see themselves in the tradition of activism that had been happening already before. Are we supposed to be leaving?
No.
Oh, okay. And in the German context, I think that I agree with you. There was a lot going on that. So for me, when Black Lives Matter took up so much space in Germany in 2020, I'm going to talk about, I remember that everyone I knew who had some kind of media presence couldn't, you know, they were receiving so many phone calls and emails and come on TV here and do this radio show here and to explain again and again. And most of the sentiment was, is there racism in Germany? And this was so frustrating for, like, we're talking about a context where, if you had been paying attention, the book Farbenbekennen, which has been translated into English as Showing Our Colours, was published in 1985. 1985, there was a publication, there was all sorts of things going on before that, but 1985, a group of young black women and lesbians had published a book and documented all sorts of realities of day-to-day life in Germany from a black female, black feminist perspective. Why are we asking this question? And also in that book, it was based on a thesis that one of the authors, Maya Him, did, where she talked about one of the first black professors in Germany is a man called Anton Wilhelm Amel, who studied at the end of the 18th century in Germany. We know that there have been black Germans for this time. So why are we now in 2020 asking this question? That was highly frustrating. The other thing that Black Lives Matter did was it kind of gave the impression that police brutality and racism was only a US phenomena, and oh my goodness, that thing happened over there, and we're very upset about it over here. And we're like, okay, so what about Uri Jallo, Mariam Indesa, Dominique Kudiabo? And there's names and names of black people who were killed by the police in Germany. Black communities in Germany have been trying to raise awareness of it. Many, many white people have no idea. So that was very upsetting. And then we have the aspect that you mentioned, which is to do with the language. The German language, I mean, I was going to mention, I can't remember who said it, but it came up that the idea of being German, you said it, Jackie, the idea of being German and the idea of being black were two completely separated things.
An oxymoron.
It was an oxymoron, and that was something that, I mean, I think immediately of 1935 Nuremberg laws, where many people, many Jewish people, who up until that point had been Jewish German, or German, were suddenly like, you cannot be German anymore because you're Jewish, out. And many black Germans lost their nationality then. So for me, since that time, you will often hear people talk about, this guy's Jewish and this guy's German, as if they were two completely separate things. And this was part of the reason why you had a specific activism in black German communities around reclaiming language, like the names that black people have been called prior to the 80s were names that they did not want to identify with themselves, right? Taken from the animal kingdom. I mean, mongrel would be the translation. They didn't want to call themselves mongrels, of course. So they were like coining new terms, black German or Afro-German, for example. But technically it's very difficult to try to establish a discourse around race in the German language because we don't have something called black studies in Germany. There isn't like an institutionalized body of research around, you know, even documenting that there is such a thing as anti-black racism has been an uphill struggle because we don't have ethnic monitoring and research in Germany. So we can't quantify how many black people there are in Germany. We can do it by nationality. We can tell you how many Nigerians are in Germany. But we can't talk about race in that way. So this has been the work of Black German activists to try and come up with qualitative and quantitative
Categories, yeah.
data and such. The vocabulary we use is often from the US. We talk about people of color in German because we can't talk about we can't use any other words for it. We talk about
Leute.
yeah, it's not a good idea.
No, I know exactly. It's like coloured people that are coloured in.
And
to people
it's a
that are
big
not coloured
debate
in.
about this word race. I don't know if you know, what's that book called again? Why I'm no longer talking to black people about race.
To white people
White,
about race,
sorry.
yeah.
I do talk to black people. So this
Rennie
book,
Adolodge,
Rennie
yeah.
Adolodge's book was translated into German with the title Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Skin Colour. But race and skin colour are not the same thing. And so it was really frustrating for black people. Like I said, we have been talking about this and trying to find a vocabulary for it in the in the German language, and then comes along a white translator who translates this book by a black activist into German and doesn't reference any of the existing knowledge from black German. I'm shouting. I get emotional when I talk about this. So yeah, so good and bad. Then mental load, I wanted to say. Your question about additional labour. And the way I understood your question was something like the additional work that goes to even just sitting in a room and just like negotiating. So I find myself negotiating fragility a lot and almost tears, almost waiting. You know, hopefully no one cries around me, but I do a lot of work to make sure that nobody cries around me. You know what I mean? And that is exhausting, and I tended to underestimate that. And recently I've been trying to tell my publishers that, look, this cannot go on. I can't keep being the only black person in a space of literature people who actually want to learn about racism. If I was an anti-racist trainer, I wouldn't do it alone. I'd go in with another person at least, and there'd be a briefing and debriefing and such. Like, what I'm doing isn't sustainable. And the word mental load came to me. Have you know, yeah. Mental load. I love this word because it describes an aspect of work that it didn't have a name for so many years in my life, but it describes very well what many people who are raised as female in the society do. They just do an additional amount of, project management, basically. Emotional labour. They're the ones who think about, oh yeah, this thing needs to be bought, we need to write it on the shopping list, but why are we shopping? We also bring the other thing that we didn't write down on the shopping list. And They do all this additional work and it's not recognised at all. And I think it's a similar thing that I do a lot of additional work that hasn't got a name, but I definitely feel the toll. So I don't know, at this moment in time, I'm like, if it's not recognised and somehow compensated for, I don't mean financially even, but somehow has to be compensated for, then I would have to stop doing it. That's definitely a
Do you
thing.
have a YouTube channel where you can do this so that you don't have to repeat it all the time?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, because people have to go to another session now.
Yes, yes.
So we need to go. I just want to very briefly take two tiny little things which you've picked on. For example, I remember Victoria, my PhD, having the question, what ethnicity are you?
Yeah.
And my supervisor in Paris said, tu es raciste ou quoi? Are you a racist? I said, this is the Office of National Statistics in the UK. But to ask French people what their ethnicity was, yeah, so this is a real problem. And there's some issues in Germany. I remember we advertised jobs at WZB, and you say you encourage women to apply. And I said, and people with disabilities and from the ethnic minorities. Oh no, it's not bother about those.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
This is the 90s. So these things matter. They really do matter, and they matter because we trying to talk about racism in Europe. So often with some of my colleagues on European projects, it's about migrants. I said, yeah, but their grandparents have been here, right? They've been in Italy for hundreds of years or whatever. But there's like immigration culture, but it's very difficult to just understand. You can be black German, you can be black British or black Italian or whatever, but it's very difficult to break through that. Anyway, enough said of that. There's lots of, I thank you both of you very much for a really